So welcome to the sixth book discussion session under our series Rendezvous with the Author. We've all realized how educative and illuminating it is to interact directly with accomplished authors who are practitioners in various fields. And today, to enlighten us further, we have with us two writers, Harsh Madhusudan and Rajeev Mantri, who through their book, A New Idea of India, have undertook an impressive intellectual exercise that has defined the alternative to the Nehruvian consensus that for all practical purposes has demised since 2014. And it's a mere coincidence, that the discussion on alternatives to the Nehruvian consensus is taking place on his birth anniversary, surprisingly called Children's Day. Welcome, Harsh and Rajeev.
Thank you, Deepanshu. Thank you, Siddharth. And thank you to the India Caucus at Harvard Kennedy School and the Any Foundation that supported you guys. Thank you for having us.
Thank you for inviting us.
So talking about the background of the authors, Harsh is an India-based public markets investor, has previously worked as a consultant at Bain & Company. He has also worked with the MIT Poverty Action Lab as a research associate, and he did his undergraduate studies in economics from Dartmouth College and his MBA from INSEAD. Rajeev is the founder and managing director of an India-focused VC firm called Navam Capital. He has previously worked as a VC investor, and in 2010, he had also co-founded Biome Biosciences, which is a biotech startup focused on dermatology. Rajeev did his undergraduate in science from Northwestern University and his MBA from Columbia Business School. Both Harsh and Rajeev have written extensively on tech, investing, politics, economics, several other topics in several esteemed newspapers, from the New York Times to the Indian Express. So now let's begin the conversation with our beloved guests. My first question regarding the book is divided into two subparts, Harsh and Rajeev, and both the parts are interconnected. I'll go with the first part for Rajeev. So the book is titled A New Idea of India, with making space, with in a new idea of India, making space for other ideological formulations as against the previously fashionable, the idea of India, a phrase that represented the Nehruvian consensus. So how, in your opinion, is this new idea of India more accepting of the socio-cultural and religious diversity that is at the core of Indian society compared to the old idea of India?
Thank you, Deepanshu, for that, I think, very fundamental question. And a lot of the core of the book is about it, actually. So in the opening chapter of the book, actually, we talk about skepticism being innate to Hindu philosophy, being innate to the Indian way of thinking. And I think the use of the article the versus in a way captures the differences in the two approaches. So there is a certain definitive kind of almost condescending approach inherent in saying this is the idea of India. And we are, I think, also kind of caging it in a way where the indication is this cannot change. This is the idea. There is a certain finality to it, and nothing can be done about it almost. It's presented as a fait accompli. Whereas when we say a new idea of India, what we are suggesting is that there can be many ideas of India. This is one of them. And our book actually makes the case for why this idea of India probably gives a better chance for India to attain prosperity, security, social peace, economic progress, all the things that everybody wants. So in that sense, it is not ideological or it's not kind of dogmatic. We have certainly tied sort of what we feel to end outcomes as well. So if you notice the flow of the book, it begins with kind of high level philosophy, ideas, kind of more abstract stuff, going into concrete policies and concrete actions, which some of which the government has already done and some of which we recommend the government should do to achieve those objectives. Whereas the idea of India almost became, in my view, an end in itself, where those who are propounding it just seem to be happy that this is there, and they almost don't care about the rest of the downstream effects of it.
So I think a certain chaos that is talked about that should be allowed to be, played out in the sense that different ideas coming in and different interactions happening.
So there should be a certain competition of ideas, right? So why should any particular idea enjoy a monopoly for so long, especially when it has not yielded results?
Right. So do you think the space for different contestations had receded and ended in, let's say, pre-2014 or 4 decades or 5 decades after independence?
No, so I would say that was limited, right? So that contestation wasn't really happening. Maybe now it is happening because there is a counter view to the prevailing consensus. And again, my view is it should be tied to what is the outcome, what is the achievement of a particular set of ideas. Like we can't just be wedded to that and never change ourselves. I mean, in fact, in the early parts of the book, this is the case we make, that the dynamic nature of Indic philosophy, of Hindu philosophy, ties in very well with this kind of an open-minded approach. That let's keep an open mind about how things are. Let's keep eyes on the objective and not get tied to the dogma of a particular philosophy or ideology.
Got it. Thank you so much for that intervention. Harsh, the other part is for you. Right at the start of the book, there's a note on how the labels of left and right have been blindly transferred from the West to the Indian political landscape, representing edifices of certain principles and viewpoints. Do you think that is an inaccurate way to look at and understand Indian politics? And if yes, what should be the alternative?
So, Deepanshu, thanks once again for an excellent question. I agree, absolutely, as we write in the book, Rajiv and I, that this left and right imposition, it's a separate question if it even applies or is helpful in Western politics anymore, but let's come to that later. In Indian politics, it definitely creates more heat than light. And what I mean by that is when you say right and left, and because we live in a world where Western economies and Western culture and Western scholarship and Western ideas are still dominant, though it is changing, the particular history of the West, the connotations rather than the denotations, the connotations of right and left start applying to Indian politics in a very kind of, like I think V.S. Naipaul would call it like mimic men. Like we like BJP is right or Congress is left or center left, and if there are Islamists voting against the BJP for polygamy, for having the right to have 4 wives, but obviously the woman cannot have more than one husband, or no other religion can have more than one spouse, although I don't know why anybody would want that, but that's a separate question. Then that becomes something that is left wing if you go by this right left, because BJP equal to right, anybody is opposing is left, and therefore a theocratic conception is now left wing. Similarly, we write in the book that, for example, Indic philosophy has absolutely no issues with reasonable cases of abortion, for example, which is a very emotional issue in Christian and post-Christian societies, especially Catholic and post-Catholic societies, but even Protestant now. And that remains a big issue. We don't have a very hot button issue on even gay rights. I mean, we are a very conservative society, but views are rapidly changing, and there are nuanced interpretations. So what we mean by that, there is no religious reason for the quote unquote majority to oppose these on a theological basis. And these things get confused because in India, if you have to understand the Indian state and the Indian nation, you have to first understand the Indian civilization, which is what we write in the book. The Indian civilization is ancient. It's pre-1947, thousands of years. Through the instrumentation of a modern democratic state, the Indian nation itself is becoming more coherent. It's kind of congealing. And that Indian nation, because of the history of colonialism, not just British colonialism, but Turkic colonialism, has a certain take point. Like we have our own quote unquote culture wars, or what the German Bismarck used to call Kulturkampf, but they are very different from Christian or post-Christian culture wars. And because we have a certain view of that, therefore people who are on a certain civilizational side of things in India get tagged as right, when it's got nothing to do with right or left. Even the word nationalism in India is much more tied to civilizational than, say, German nationalism, which in Indian equivalent would be Punjabi nationalism, or Gujarati, it would be sub-ethnic or sub-national. So the scale and the complexity and the diversity are so different. It makes no sense to use this from a remnant of the French Revolution, the right side, for the against the revolution, the left side for the revolution. In India, even on economics, I mean, I've spoken a lot about civilizational issues in the last couple of minutes. Even on economics, the so-called right-wing prime minister has done massive welfare over the last 7 years. In fact, many hardcore libertarian capitalists were, and perhaps still are, somewhat disappointed in him, although in the last 2-3 years have been a lot of reforms. But what perhaps they fail to understand, and where my views and Rajiv's views have evolved, is if you do not give the basic facilities to all the people in terms of toilets and sanitation and water and roads and electricity, you can't even have economic growth, because they can't plug and play into the national and global economy. In fact, in that sense, Narendra Modi is the guy who's implementing Amartya Sen's capability theory, right? Because if you don't have those capabilities, the rest of the freedom is kind of notional. And so how do you then classify his economics? He has cut corporate taxes. He is privatizing. At the same time, he has a somewhat neo-mercantilistic view on trade. But on welfare, he's saying, I'll do much more, but much more about empowering people and through efficient, non-corrupt digital transfers where there is less corruption, and not necessarily about make work programs, except in emergency situations. So it's completely based on, as Rajiv said, outcomes oriented. Or as Deng Xiaoping would have said, I don't care what the color of the cat is, so long as it catches mice. Or as Lee Kuan Yew would have said, do what works. That does not mean you don't have a framework of the world. Other things being equal, market incentives work better. But there is a reason why the state is also important. And hence a subtitle, individual rights in a civilizational state. That yin and yang, that kind of, that the tension between them, not just in society, but also in economics. That there is a libertarian case, but there is a civilizationist/collectivist case. And how do you kind of pick and choose between them in a non-ideological fashion while still having philosophical grounding? So I agree again with Rajiv that maybe ideology is not the right word. You need some first principles, but the first principles ultimately have to respond to the reality on the ground. You can't change the reality to suit the theory. You have to change the theory to suit the reality. So that's how I would look at this right and left, whether economics or social reality. It just does not compute. And increasingly, by the way, I don't think it computes even in the West, given racial tensions and the way society is going. But I don't want to make that case. I would stick to India right now.
Right. I'm glad that you brought actually the civilizational angle in your answer, because when I said that the first question is, divided into two subparts, both being interconnected, I think civilizational was the interconnecting part. Why? Because when you say the idea of India versus a new idea of India, we see that the idea of India sort of was a departure from the civilizational context that has always existed in India. And when we talk about left and right, we usually associate the ideology of right, as incorrect the word as it is, with the idea of civilization. So my next question was going to be about civilization. The byline of the book is individual rights in a civilizational state. Now, history tells us that the Indian civilization is several millennia old, and some religious groups in India today weren't, let's say, an active participant or a stakeholder in this civilizational journey from the start, because they got introduced to India only several centuries back, either through escaping persecution or orchestrating religious invasions, meaning that not all religious groups in India today have a shared history or a shared historical identity. But they're as much Indian citizens as people from other religious groups are. So how do you reconcile this civilizational asymmetry with the constitutional mandate of political and socio-economic equality as envisaged in the Constitution of the Republic of India?
Rajiv, can I go?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I think it's another excellent question, Deepanshu. I'm not just saying it; it's a very good question. The point is, how do you kind of, I think in a way, what we write about individual rights in a civilizational state, the individual rights is in a way a reference to the constitutional part of it. And if you look at the header here, this is from the fundamental rights section of the Constitution, of the original Constitution, and this is Ram, Lakshman, and Sita. So our constitution makers also were aware that, while a new nation was being created, it was very much being planted on an ancient civilization. And therefore, they cannot really be at odds with each other. Yes, they can be at odds with each other in details, in certain parts which are alterable. But if they're at odds with each other in the fundamental essence, then no piece of paper can survive, 73, 74, 75 years of free elections. I mean, ultimately, even if you have a Supreme Court that's activist, the Supreme Court doesn't have a police or an army. These things work out. People give power after losing elections, and they crib and they cry, but by and large, people have accepted the fairness of Indian elections. So this system works because ultimately it is in consonance with the Indian civilizational ethos. Now, what is that? The word that we look for is dharma. So Rajeev mentioned that in the very first chapter, we talk about skepticism. Now, skepticism need not be in any way opposed to devotion or worship. In fact, not to get too philosophical, I think the best devotion and worship comes after the phase and period of skepticism, right? It's kind of leavened by that skepticism. So that skepticism in the Indian ethos basically says, my salvation, if you want to use an English or a Christian word, or my moksha, is my moksha. It is my path to it. I am not going out of my way to tell Deepanshu or Rajiv or Siddharth that, by the way, you must do this, which I have figured out. Otherwise, you are doomed and damned forever. And that basic idea on the theological front immediately leads to not just tolerance, but mutual respect. Because for me, this is my spiritual journey. In fact, in the same household, somebody might be a massive Shiv Bhakt, another person might be a complete Krishna Bhakt, somebody might be a Bhakt of Devi, and somebody else might be an atheist. And that is completely normal in so many Hindu families we see all around of us, right? There is no concept of you must do this. And now that does not mean that if there is theological mutual respect, that Indian society did not have social hierarchical problems. We did, of caste and obviously of gender. But those things are to be understood not as the essence of the civilization, but as the reality of an agricultural feudal society. You go to France, you go to Japan, they also had a caste system. In fact, the very word caste comes from the Portuguese word casta, right, which refers to color, and basically the kind of hierarchy they made in Latin America, in South America, based on the whites at the top and the dark-skinned people at the bottom and the mixed races in the middle. And they basically kind of superimposed that onto India. This is not to say India did not have a problem of Varna being fixed by birth and hierarchies. I'm not saying Westerners invented our caste problem. I'm not making that apologetic point. But I'm saying that a certain misinterpretation came in, and that actually had more to do with our economics. The moment our economics change, we're industrializing, we are urbanizing, and now it doesn't really matter what your caste is. Of course, there's a transition period. There is affirmative action. There is a sense of more and more people finally becoming economically mobile in the society, more intermarriage happening. And so that part of social hierarchy becomes less important because of economics and constitutional realities. But the essence, which is important not just for India, but for the world, that is automatically amenable to individual rights. And when Rajiv and I speak about rights, we don't mean that duties are not important. But duties will, of course, be enforced by the state. If you don't pay your taxes, you'll be put in jail. But so for society, maybe family is the unit. But for state, individual must be the unit. And that's a distinction we make.
Right. Rajiv, what would be your intervention on this? How do we reconcile this civilizational asymmetry, with the mandate of providing political and socio-economic equality to everyone?
No, so first of all, I think the Constitution already does that. Even there are certain inequities. As we describe in the book, there is a system of group rights in India in many domains. And our argument has been that India needs to move towards a regime of individual rights, where the state sees all citizens as individuals. How individuals see each other is up to them. But in the eyes of the state, there should be no distinction based on religion or other kinds of identities like that. And even where there's affirmative action, we've actually argued that there is a case to have a sunset clause. There's a case to make sure that the efficacy of those affirmative action programs is established. So what is very controversial in India right now is some of the caste-based reservations, for example. Some of those programs are apparently being captured by a so-called creamy layer, as you say in India. And there is a debate underway that should caste-based reservations be available in perpetuity, or should there be, if one generation accesses it, should the next generation be eligible for it? Those kind of debates are underway. Having said that, the other, I think, kind of conflict point or fault line emerges when there are very divergent values in a society. Now, those values could differ based on different worldviews, different faith systems. You can call it whatever you want. But I think a lot of democracies are grappling with this. Even in the Western world, we are finding that because of immigration in certain countries, they have constituencies that are not abiding by, let's say, what a country like France would hold dear to itself, like free speech. So they are finding that certain constituencies in France don't want to abide by that. It's the same for other European countries, even in the US. So I think every country is grappling with it. India has just been grappling with it for longer because we've always had this kind of diversity. And I think the way to resolve it is through rule of law. There's no doubt about that.
I'm glad that you've touched upon the topic or the tension that exists between individual as well as group identity in social as well as administrative affairs. So my next question is on that. The book talks about, group identity perilously prevailing over a citizen's individual identity, not just in the social realm, but also in the administrative one. Kerala's governor, Arif Muhammad Khan, has written and talked about it extensively. He considers this, let's say, akin to the pre-independence, system of communal electorates, meaning only Hindus can elect Hindu leaders and only Muslims can elect Muslim leaders, because that becomes your worldview towards everything that's happening. So this dangerous idea, along with political ambitions of a few, led to the partition of the country. So how do you reverse this process so that I recognize myself first as an Indian citizen rather than a member of a religious or a socio-cultural group?
So I think this is a very good point. You can compare it to the separate electorates we had pre-independence. You can even compare it to the Ottoman Khilafat millet system. The millets in Ottoman society was, well, there is an Islamic Sharia on the top, but the Jews and the Christians have their own personal laws and courts. And so long as there was no, the other person was not an Ottoman Sunni Turkic Muslim, they could basically resolve their cases internally. It is what has happened in India. We've gotten that system when it comes to personal laws, but when it comes to economic welfare, then we say everybody is equal. In fact, in many ways, then we actually go out of our way to do kind of ostensible reverse discrimination on the basis of religion, which Rajiv hinted at earlier. So the way we have to kind of solve this issue in India is by first and foremost saying society. I'm just disagreeing a bit with you, Deepanshu, that socially I can say I am this or that religion or even caste. Socially, I may not even necessarily always say I'm an Indian first, so long as you're not in the territory of sedition. But for the government, it is very important, especially in the realm of religion, to see people as individual citizens, because as you rightly hinted, we've had partition on the basis of that already in India, and that's only 75 years ago. And this, unless it is very clearly understood that religious loyalties do not translate into national loyalties, I think in a democratic system, a counter reaction is inevitable. A peaceful counter reaction is inevitable. One hopes and prays, and then that creates more tensions in society and leads to less harmony. So we must, for example, have the same personal laws for everybody. That's how it is in the United States. That's how it is in Australia. That's how it is in Canada, right? I mean, if there is no reason why, based on my religion, I should have different laws when it comes to inheritance or marriage. And if at all I want to personalize it, we can always have some kind of prenup or postnup contracts. But that's an individualized customization. That's not a religion-based customization that is forced upon you. For example, fairly recently, many Muslims could not easily adopt in India. And just imagine the pain of a couple which are not able to have a child for whatever reason, and they want to adopt someone, and they are completely pious Muslims in every other way, but the state is telling them, you must choose between this identity and this beauty and this reality of your life that you aspire to. So I think there are very basic things that we can do first in education. For example, St. Stephen's, a sister college RCC in Delhi University, gets most of its money from the government of India, but has massive reservations for Christians. Now, if you point out that thing in polite society, people are like, communal, this guy is communal. But I don't understand how that is the case, because we have to talk honestly, frankly, and completely fairly about it, I must say. Rajiv, you want to add something?
No, I agree. I mean, I think we have to start by first disentangling the state from all these interventions, where the government is coming and saying, okay, you are this, so you should do this. You are that, hence you will get that. And this person who's from this particular group does not get that. So I think let's make a beginning by first extricating the government from this business. And then in the realm of society, there's, I think a churning is kind of inevitable. A social level debate is inevitable. And I don't think anyone wants to sort of obviously, go through the horror of a second partition. So there will have to be some kind of truth and reconciliation at some point, where people have to say that fine, this happened in the past. There are certain belief systems which are kind of in conflict, but this is how we choose to resolve them. And as a society, everyone agrees to resolve them and move on.
So do you think the step has been taken in that direction of reconciliation, let's say post 2014 or in general?
No, so I think we are still in early days for that, right? So, I mean, there cannot be reconciliation without truth first, right? So first we need to, like Harsh was mentioning, now it is still controversial to even say some of these things in polite society. And, immediately people say, oh, this guy is a communal or various other impolite labels and kind of descriptions are thrust onto you. So first of all, I think more people need to speak about it openly. Once we have an honest conversation, then we can fairly assess, what had happened, what did not happen, what should happen going forward. So without some kind of measured accommodation from all sides, you can't really talk about this and honestly move forward. And like I said, that needs to be preceded by, or maybe, this can also happen in parallel, that the government should sort of get out of this business of I would say almost bribing certain constituencies.
No, in that sense, I'm pretty glad that the book has such a book has come about, because I think this book, it would have come out 20 years back, it would have been considered more politically incorrect than it is considered now.
No, and we try to make that point pretty transparently in the third chapter. If you read the third chapter of the book, we've tried to lay the record bare of just the last 20 years. So in our research, we found many other episodes. And the more you dig, the more you find. You can go back all the way to the Nehru prime ministership. And you can find episode after episode of such discrimination, of such arbitrary kind of rule making, law making. But we just gave a record of the last 20 years. And in fact, a lot of people have written to us saying that, this was an eye-opening chapter.
I think that's the chapter wherein you talk about the kind of scholarships and the kind of other public service goods that were designed and delivered.
That's the chapter titled Saving Secularism from the Secularists.
Right. Okay, so with this, I come to the last question from my side before we open the floor for the audience. We often see and experience, that evoking the fact that India is a civilizational republic invites the label of being a political conservative person in a pejorative sense of the word. And it is used to label the political conservatives in the country as being medieval in their conceptualization and outlook towards the society. But the policy actions of, let's say, decriminalizing homosexuality and criminalizing triple talaq convey a different story, in that both the corrective actions were supported by the political conservatives or heralded or taught about by a so-called political conservative government regime or a prime minister. And we saw the different reactions by cultural and religious bodies to, let's say, the act of decriminalizing homosexuality. And the reactions and the difference in reaction is pretty surprising, because you would expect a certain kind of reaction to come from so-called conservative groups, but their reaction was completely in line with, let's say, a millennial's understanding of modernity. If you could bring out this difference and clear the myth around linking political conservatives to being medieval.
So, Deepanshu, we write about that in the book. In fact, if I remember the line correctly, we write that, Hindutva, as some people call it, is a conservative only in the broadest sense of trying to conserve Indian civilization. But Indian civilization itself is about change. So, it's traditional only in the sense of traditions keep on evolving. So the very idea in India, this this sense of gay rights should be opposed has no religious basis, right? People have various views. People say, well, maybe it should not be in our face in terms of, Western LGBT rallies. Fine, they might have their own views, but nobody is saying that this is against Hinduism, for example, which is said in Western debates that this is against Christianity or this is against Islam. And I think that in many ways is the most important point here, because when you say conservative, small c or capital C, what are you trying to conserve? It's the question is, what are you trying to conserve? We are trying to conserve this open system, but this open system is not so open as the phrase goes that your mind falls out, right? In the sense that we invoke Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance. We say that we want maximum openness so long as it is in consonance with keeping the entire system itself safe. And there's a very interesting chapter Rajiv and I have written about Kashmir, Pakistan, and Karl Popper, right? I mean, a bit of a alliteration there, KP. And we basically said that, we compared, for example, the Northern Ireland debate and, the Irish terrorism, which also happened till a few decades ago, and how that compares with Kashmir. And we compared India to the rest of UK, Kashmir to Northern Ireland, and Pakistan with the rest of Ireland. And how, because the salience of religious conservatism of the type you are talking about, in which there is, theocratic laws, or where things like abortion and gay rights are looked down upon, that was so important in the Catholic versus Protestant religious war, which is what the Northern Ireland conflict eventually was, because of course there were Irish people on both sides. And we basically say that if a Northern Ireland basically joins Ireland and leaves UK, it remains now part of the civilizational modern West. It will probably join EU and NATO. It's already part of NATO. As part of UK, it will join EU, even Scotland. But in India, we talk about the fact that if Kashmir, the Kashmir Valley, for example, joins the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, not only Hindus, Sikhs, and Buddhists, not only women and LGBT, not only Dalits, but even Shia Muslims and Ahmadi Muslims would be persecuted as per the current laws of Pakistan. And therefore, this is the civilizational divide, and this is what we are trying to conserve, this open system. And which is why, if I just want to mention the last point, we distinguish between civilization and culture. For example, if you are studying in the US, like Rajiv and I did earlier, especially if you're a North Indian, but even otherwise, the cultural commonalities with Pakistanis, and if you're Bengali with Bangladeshis, is so obvious, right, in terms of language and food and movies and stuff. But we distinguish between culture and civilization. Culture might overlap, so culture in that sense is skin deep, but civilization is soul deep. And there is a clear civilizational divide between a Hindu secular India and Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And I think saying that is not in any way meant to disparage anybody. It is just acknowledging the reality, hoping that this problem solves, because ultimately it's a human tragedy. It's a human tragedy for all of the subcontinent's almost 2 billion people. So that's how we think of culture, civilization, and conservatism in the very broad sense.
Rajiv, over to you.
No, just to, I think Harsh put it very well. I will just, he said if you're conservative, what are you trying to conserve? By the same token, when someone accuses you of being a fundamentalist, what are the fundamentals? So what are the fundamentals of Hinduism? Let's talk about that. What are the fundamentals of Dharma? Let's talk about that. So as we write in the book, one of the Mahavakyas, Tat Tvam Asi, you are that. It goes back to the idea of treating everyone as you wish they should treat you. And whether you talk about inclusiveness, whether you talk about mutual respect, I mean, these are the fundamentals of the Hindu way. So there is no need to be apologetic about it. I think a lot of time, there is a tendency, especially in the Western media, to focus on the most fringe element, some ragtag group which has no support, and they will bring that to the front page of the Washington Post or the New York Times, and assert that this is the Hindu India that BJP has brought, or Modi has brought, or whoever. misrepresent things like that. Whereas if you look at how many votes are these guys getting, like how many votes did this fringe party get? They're not even getting a few hundred or a few thousand votes in an election. Who's supporting them? And one of the most beautiful examples recently that we all saw when the transgender folk dancer Manjamma Jogatiji, she was recently recognized with the Padma Shri just some days ago, and the celebration that came out of that, you could see on social media all so-called right-wing accounts, the Hindutva accounts, whatever you want to call them. Everyone was welcoming it. Everyone was celebrating it because everyone sees this as part of India's diversity. No one sees this as something that is alien to India, that is sort of not part of our culture. I mean, there's example after example of this. But I said at that time that India doesn't need lessons in inclusivity from the woke activists in the West or some other diversity sort of scholars or whatever they call themselves. We've had this for centuries and we'll always have it.
I'm glad you mentioned the New York Times because there's a particular sentence that was spoken by India's External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, and I think that sentence has become very handy for multiple students over here who are living in the US. So we keep on saying that sentence ourselves, which is India's reputation is not decided by what a newspaper in New York writes. So that sentence is very handy for us whenever a discussion around what an op-ed in a particular newspaper said about India. But thank you both for actually bringing up the issue of Kashmir as well, because we had one question from a guy called Aryan Singh who had posed that question before the session even started. And his question is that in this new idea of India, how do you place the larger issue of Kashmir and the security issues around it? And he also says that, of course, one Zoom discussion cannot really ruminate upon what solutions exist to the Kashmir problem, but largely, how do you see in the context of 370 getting removed and this new idea of India becoming popular as it should have earlier as well? How do you see the Kashmir issue? And what are the possible areas in which progress can be done in order to assimilate it with the larger Indian culture?
So as I mentioned, we have a section in the book called Kashmir, Pakistan, and Karl Popper, and we obviously kind of refer to Popper's paradox of intolerance or tolerance, and the idea is just that, right? I mean, again, the individual rights in a civilizational state is meant to capture the yin and yang. We want maximum freedom, but that freedom cannot be at the expense of the system which enables that freedom, and that system, therefore, it has some duties. For example, during the dictatorship that is known as the emergency, euphemistically known as the emergency, 1975 to 77, where Indira Gandhi forcibly put the words secular and socialist in the Indian constitution, which, by the way, Ambedkar had a strong disagreement with. Nonetheless, she also added a section to the preamble saying the integrity of the nation, right? So rights and duties are always the two sides of the same coin. And what are the duties, therefore, in that context is you preserve the unity and integrity of the nation. You do not try to establish a theocracy. And in the case of Kashmir, just for the viewers, Article 370 and Article 35A, broadly speaking, there was special autonomy given to Kashmir because of its socio-cultural uniqueness, which is, again, code for its Muslim majorityness. And the idea was, because it's a Muslim majority region bordering Pakistan wants it. A lot of people within the valley of a more fundamentalist disposition want to secede from India. Therefore, let us be on the defensive and let us just basically give them more autonomy so long as they're within the Union of India in some nominal sense, no matter how many soldiers of India get killed every year because of terrorist, jihadi, or Fidayeen attacks. Now, what this government has done is said, no, we'll of course hold on, but we will change, no pun intended, the secular trend of the Kashmir problem, so to speak. We'll basically say that you are an integral part of India, as we have been saying, but not doing. And therefore, if people want to move to Kashmir, then we will slowly facilitate that. First and foremost, beginning with the Dalits who have been cleaning toilets there, but not getting rights. Then the West Pakistani, Punjabi, or from Gilgit-Baltistan, or from so-called Azad Kashmir, the Punjabis, Sikhs, and Hindus who have been there for 70 years, they can vote in Lok Sabha elections, but they could not vote in the local assembly elections. They've been given the right to vote. There is a massive push to get Kashmiri Pandits, or more broadly Kashmiri Hindus, who want to go back to the Kashmir Valley, to allow them a safe area. And again, there are many terrorist attacks precisely to prevent that. And finally, people out of trade, tourism, investment, and just general migration can also be considered in a step-by-step fashion. The idea is, as Indians intermix, then automatically this problem dilutes. Just as, there are always some people in Maharashtra or West Bengal or Karnataka or Tamil Nadu who are unhappy that outsiders are coming in, right? There is always a problem, but we do not put their views on the top, because we say we are one nation. And while we might give that quote unquote autonomy to some hilly regions, but so long as they're not fundamentally secessionist, it's fine. But in the case of Kashmir, this clearly was a self-goal. And therefore, this is something India decided to remove. Home Minister Amit Shah and Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And obviously, Pakistan made a big deal about it, because Pakistan's entire strategy was, we'll basically keep on killing Indian soldiers and they won't even do what is in their obvious self-interest. And which is why the Pakistani Prime Minister keeps on going to Twitter every second day and calls Narendra Modi, the leader of the world's largest democracy, won 2 straight majorities, a fascist with a straight face. Even though he calls liberals to be bloodthirsty liberals in his own country. So this is the crux of the issue, where a theocratic problem is being solved in a humanitarian, quote unquote, genuinely secular way, in line with the Indic civilization. And obviously, it is not good news for people who have a vested interest in perpetuating that problem.
Over to you, Rajeev.
No, so I think I would just add to what Harsh said. I would say, the intellectual vacuity of the Nehruvian way, to me, is brought out most in its 2 stands on Uniform Civil Code and Article 370. Nothing brings out the double speak, the double standard, other than, or rather, nothing brings it out so well as the brazen support for these 2 things. And it's hard to understand why an Indian political party should even support this anymore. And clearly, even within the Congress, as we saw 2 years ago, lots of their major leaders broke ranks with the party line. And many of those leaders have now even left the party. Maybe this was one of the contributing factors. So it just goes to show that, sticking with this line today is not a mainstream position in India. And those who stick with it will probably, face consequences for it from the electorate. Because if the fundamental claim that Pakistan has on Kashmir is, it's a Muslim majority region, so thus it should have come to Pakistan. So what is going to happen now if we theoretically see the demographics that are playing out in states like Assam, in West Bengal, in Kerala? If tomorrow they too were to become Muslim majority, can Pakistan claim that now this is also ours? Is that the basis on which the country's territory is going to be redrawn on religious lines after having gone through the pain of partition? So that is simply unacceptable in today's day and age. And I'm glad that the government sort of has drawn firm red lines around this. And to me, it's no longer even a mainstream position for any intellectual, for any political party to take, that Article 370 should be restored or brought back or anything of that sort. I don't even think it's credible anymore.
Got it. Thank you so much, guys. We move to the questions from the audience. Can we have a show of hands? And then we can invite them to ask their questions. Manvi has texted saying, please have me like. Manvi, would you want to go ahead, ask your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I can turn my video on first place because that helps. And in today's world, I must say your book and its ideas are very ambitious, because you definitely have the possibility of being tagged as bugs, so to say. But I truly applaud you for bringing these ideas up, because I think it's very important, especially living in the US as an Indian. These are often questions that we are being asked. And you, Mr. Mantri, have alluded to the removal of caste-based reservations and individual rights, which I personally agree with, but all my personal biases aside, while these do seem very plausible in theory, how do we actually implement these in the current Indian political scenario when every decision by the current government is followed by, or rather I should say retaliated with, a counteraction like Shaheen Bagh? Do you think these ideas can be applied to a society where not every member of the society agrees to our ideas of Tattvamasi or even Vasudev Kutumbakam?
No, so thank you for that question, Manvi. So I would say on the specific issue of reservations, so even Baba Sahib Ambedkar ji, Dr. Ambedkar had said that reservations should have a 10-year sunset clause. Now it's another matter that every party simply extends it for another 10 years, right? No one has the political courage to actually put a stop to it. And there are very good reasons for caste-based reservations, and in some cases even gender-based reservations. And as we argue in the book, caste and gender are not something that are easy to change, right? Unlike religion. So if you have religion-based reservations, like some parties have tried to implement, we see that as an incentive for conversions. And then, as classical liberals, we do not want the state to incentivize conversions. So when it comes to caste reservations in particular, I think in education, in the field of education specifically, one of the problems has been a supply side sort of constriction. So one of the ways to solve this problem is to solve the supply side, where we have more medical colleges, where we have more, business schools, we have more engineering schools, so that those who want to study can get that access. I think once we address the supply side issue, we would sort of address that problem to a significant degree. Where there's enough number of seats and enough opportunity available for those who want to study to become doctors and so on. Right. I do think the kind of cynical game that certain politicians did play in the past was they tried to shrink the pie and then divvy it up and then give it to this group and that group to play essentially vote bank politics. That's what was going on. Whereas the solution to this, in my view, is expand supply and make sure that enough people are able to compete, are able to win those seats, mostly on merit. And the other aspect of this is where we have within the caste groups certain particular subcastes kind of cornering the benefits. So that too, I think there needs to be an honest debate in society, in sort of the public domain, where we are actually asking, are these reservations working? We've had them now for 30 years since Mandal, and who's really benefiting from it? And how should they be restructured so that those who are not benefiting get those benefits? Again, like it should be tied to whether it works. It should be tied to what is the efficacy. If it's not working for everyone, I think it's time to re-look at it, rather than just carry on pretending that we are doing some great work in social justice.
So I'll add to that, Deepanshu, with your permission. Manvi, I think it's
please go ahead.
Excellent question. I think Rajeev has answered on the policy side. Let me try to kind of think about it more broadly. I think one of the things when you go to the US, it's very interesting. Of course, it's very interesting that you have Indian Americans, Chinese Americans. You don't really have white Americans, although occasionally they say they're Italian Americans, whatnot. But what I find beautiful, if one goes beyond that, is they say, well, they're 1/8 Italian and 1/4 German and so much Irish and this and that. And the reality in India is that, while again we've been a civilization, you cannot be a modern nation if there is hardly any intermarriage. That is the reality of any nation, because the point is, if people are living in kind of more or less closed groups, then what happens is people see other people's success not as a success of that individual, but as a success of that group. And as what Rajeev mentioned, if I were to just make it broader a bit, supply of schools and colleges, sure. But in general, because we got economic policies wrong, which we talk about in chapter 4 and indirectly in chapter 5, since overall economic growth was less and therefore socioeconomic mobility was less, what happened is people who were already quote unquote privileged, if we are honest about it, they did get a chance to move ahead faster. For example, even under Nehru's education policy, there's a lot of focus on IITs, but absolutely deplorably low focus on basic primary education. Again, the things that Narendra Modi is doing about schools and basic sanitation, electricity, or as something as simple as women not having to go and get firewood to cook food, and therefore they're getting gas instead. These things of basically broadening the pyramid. Once there is growth, there is socioeconomic mobility, there is intermarriage, the judicial system is good enough so that we can have contracts amongst business partners of different backgrounds. What happens is, historically, the business community in India would not really do contracts on paper, right? What happened is they were all intermarried to each other, and therefore if somebody defaulted, you would basically go and shame him in society. That was a social sanction which worked. So what we are transitioning from a kind of a social closed system to a modern state-based system. This is what capitalism is. And because the transition in India took much longer than we anticipated in 1947, it becomes difficult to look at a Dalit with a straight face and say, action, right? Because the reality is that kind of socioeconomic opportunity is not being provided yet. But as Rajiv and I have said, in theory, in concept, there has to be a sunset clause, because otherwise you're not individuals if this is permanent. But I think that has to happen when there is more prosperity and economic and social mobility in the society. And for example, I have written on social media, why not aim for that realistically completely to go away by 2047, 100th year of independence, like the Chinese Communist Party has targets for 2049. So I think this is one of the things which is intrinsically linked to the making of India as a modern nation, and not just as an ancient civilization. Because once people think of somebody's success as their success, the legitimacy of the entire system becomes much more in a political economy sense. So I think for 1500 years, or maybe almost 2000 years, genetic data shows Indians have been basically endogamous. And the latest intermarriage rates are around 5%. They might be outdated numbers, maybe more like 7 or 10%. There was a Japanese group called the Burka Min, which is equivalent to the Indian Dalits. And they had an intermarriage rate with the rest of Japanese society at 5 to 10% in the 1940s. Today, it's around 70%. And therefore, nobody with a serious face talks about Japanese Dalits. I mean, there are some people who do try to keep the identity alive, and there might be some very residual discrimination as well. But basically, that problem is gone. Similarly, there was a group in France. The problem is gone because that group as such does not exist anymore. So I think we also have to think about problems with our own history. But I think basically we do need to remove them, provided there is certain prosperity and socioeconomic mobility. Yeah.
No, thank you. That was a wonderful, wonderful answer. And I don't want to take time away from other participants, but I would also love to connect with both of you separately. Is there a way I could do that? However is convenient for both of you.
Just add me on LinkedIn, and otherwise Deepanshu is there for Rajiv and my contact. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise.
We have next question from Siddharth. Siddharth, would you want to go ahead?
Thank you so much. So I come from Kerala and right down south, and I've been seeing since the rise of the BJP in the center, I've seen this north-south divide maybe rising within certain communities and certain communities. Let's go with that. So how do you think that particular aspect, that north-south divide, is going to be in the new idea of India, and also for our civilizational success?
Harsh, you want to go first?
Okay, I'll go first. Okay, Siddharth, thank you for an excellent question. I think that's another fault line. That's one way to look at it. It's also another beautiful aspect of our diversity. North-South is not just regional. There is also an element of linguistic diversity that we have to discuss. And there's also an element of this. I personally think it's not true, the so-called Aryan invasion or migration theory. Although I do say that even if it is true, it does not change the civilizational vitality and fundamentals of India. But I personally don't think it is true, actually. And it has caused a lot of damage by saying that, oh, well, the North Indians are a separate race and South Indians were conquered or subjugated, and there is a caste angle to it, and now they want to enforce Hindi or Sanskrit, and therefore some people dream of Dravidistan, even though it's a very fringe group. But you're right, it is always kind of there in the background. So I think the first thing to understand is India cannot be a Unitarian state. It has to be a federal state, right? That is one way you kind of take out a lot of the tensions. And I think by and large, even though there are real problems with it, the linguistic state reorganization did take away a lot of these kinds. It acted as a vent for a lot of the steam to go away. Although again, it has real problems. I think on the diversity side of language, for example, I've always believed that in the long run, we need an Indian language. Because if you don't have an Indian language at scale, it's basically English all the way. Like, for example, we are all, in this case, at least Indians, speaking to each other in English, which is perfectly fine. And English is a de facto Indian language today. But that language cannot be Hindi. Because if you say that language is Hindi, then that has a very understandable negative response in South India, parts of East India, even parts of West India, because the logic is right that, you know, a lot of people grew up with this language. They have a natural advantage in it. So why should that language be the national language? Right now, it's only official language. And why should our language not be? And I think that is a very fair point. So I think once India gets richer, Rajiv, you, me, Deepanshu, people like us will have to think whether we need to do on a continental scale what the Israeli state did on a much tinier scale, that is revive Hebrew. Hebrew was a dead language for all practical purposes. So I think the only language in India which can be a genuinely national civilizational language is Sanskrit. Because that's a language that actually has a lot of affinities down south as far as Malayalam. And I think so basically language debate has to be thought in a nuanced manner without imposing Hindi in any way. Regional debates need to be diffused to federalism. I think theories like Aryan invasion theory will anyways die of empirical basis. But even if they are partially true, the reality remains that all Indians are intermixed, except perhaps the people who live on Andaman Islands. Like, this is genetically true. It's just a gradient. Every single Indian, until endogamy took over around 1500 or 2000 years ago, were dramatically intermixed. It's just a gradient. So Indians literally are as much of a race, even though race is not a scientific concept, it's a pseudo-scientific concept. But if you want to use it colloquially, it is as much as one race as it gets. Yes, some people are a bit more Caucasoid, some are more Mongoloid, some are more Australoid. You can talk about those things. So I think basically we have to have economic integration. Bangalore is the technology capital of India. People are going there. Other people are coming to Delhi. So I think commerce and migration will automatically reduce this problem. One last point I'll mention is about the voting rights, the census, for example. Right now, some states have much more voting rights than their population would designate, because northern Indian states therefore increase the population much more in the last 30-40 years. So we will need some creative solution around that. So I'll pause at that.
No, so Harsh, I think address the socio-cultural and parts of the political sort of debate there. I'll just talk about the economic side of things. So if we see how things have played out, particularly post-liberalization, some of the southern states have economically done better than the northern and especially the eastern states. So there is this kind of perception that why should the southern states pay for North India or subsidize them and so on. Certain politicians even try to create fissures between North and South using this kind of line. But I don't think that's the right way to view it. Ultimately, there is a great benefit that the South or the southern regions get from being part of the Indian Union. I don't think we can simply say that they are contributing tax revenues or they are contributing certain growth, so they can do better on their own. I think that would be stretching the argument too far. In fact, there is a lot of credit due to the southern states, in particular Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, who've done extremely well in the last 25-30 years. If we go back to the 1990s, a state like Andhra Pradesh was quite agrarian, and not the kind of technology and knowledge industry powerhouse that it is today. So in fact, I would highly recommend this book called The Making of Miracles in Indian States, co-edited by the eminent economist Arvind Panagaria, that goes into details of how Andhra Pradesh actually achieved its transformation over a 15-20 year period. So there is a case that most states need to reform, and often, in the debate on economic reforms in India, we underrate the role of states. So some of the eastern states, northeastern states, even northern states, I mean UP being one of the biggest ones, need to see a certain economic transformation and really pull their weight for India to grow. I would always put it as, for India to grow well, these states have to do well. I think taking an adversarial view that, the southern states did well and the northern states didn't do well, I think that's an overly simplistic narration of what is really a much more complex economy that is India.
So just to very quickly add to Rajiv's point on the economics, I think it's a very important point. I think, ultimately we must also remember that along with governance and demographics, these are interlinked to economic performance. Southern and Western states had the benefit of being port states. And what happened is India historically has a very dense population in the Ganga Jamuna region, right? The Gangetic plains, and UP, Bihar, West Bengal, and other parts surrounding it. And what we did was we did not build basic infrastructure there. And in fact, these rivers used to be navigable, and therefore they used to transport agriculture and other stuff. Because of more and more irrigation canals being cut out, their flow was not enough for them to be navigable for commercial purposes. And so, their highways effectively got stopped, and we did not build actual highways. Similarly, as you were mentioning, Rajiv and Nehru did not really focus on primary education. So we basically did not give them enough capabilities. I think that is changing right now. It will take some time. But I think I see more convergence than divergence in Indian states' economic performances if I look at the next 20 years instead of the last 20 years. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. And thank you so much, guys, for actually attending this session, agreeing for actually, participating in the session and answering the questions. I know that we are 8 minutes past the time that we had decided, and both of you have got engagements. So thank you so much, guys, for taking out the time, and we wish you the best of health. And we actually look forward to reading more books by you and engaging in discussions on them, because I agree and I completely understand that no single Zoom, session can talk about topics related to a country as diverse, large, and as complex as India. A very educative session that has been organized with the collaboration of India Caucus at the Harvard Kennedy School and with the help of Rath Foundation, a leading NGO from Haryana. So, namaste.
Namaste. Thank you, Deepanshu. Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you, everybody.